Good afternoon, everyone. I have the great pleasure to be chairman of the Masterpiece Fair, and am delighted to welcome you this afternoon, a particularly stellar and international audience, if I may say so, to the first of our two sessions of the Masterpiece Symposium, Journeys Through the Material World. This symposium also serves to launch our 2021 online programme, Encountering Beauty Through the Material World. This journey of discovery will encompass monthly panel discussions, each looking at one of 5 different materials and accompanied by a stimulating series of podcasts and short videos. Leading curators from our museum partners will also choose and talk to us about favourite works in their collections. And you will find the full schedule available on masterpiecefair.com from next Monday, the 8th. Our wish with all of our educational programmes at Masterpiece is to stimulate curiosity in works of art across a broad spectrum of visitors as part of our overall goal to open the eyes of our visitors to the physical fair, to a world that for some may be not so familiar, as well as encouraging those already immersed in this wonderful world to look at works of art in a new way. For us, it is also very much about taking down the barriers of approachability. I've always found that looking at works of art myself, both through materials and understanding how something is made, to be a captivating way to engage with and discover works of art to which one may have been given less thought. Where has the material come from? Is it easy or difficult to work with? Precious? Commonplace? All of these questions and thoughts open avenues to a new world of beauty. I'm not going to take up any further time, but I would like to extend a sincere thank you to all of our deeply knowledgeable speakers, as well as to Tom Marks, who will chair today's proceedings and introduce the speakers. I'm looking forward very much to what I know will be a stimulating and vibrant discussion, and welcome to the Stories of Materials. Tom.
Thank you very much, Philip. I'm delighted to be here to chair this Masterpiece Symposium. I'm Tom Marks, the editor of Apollo magazine, and over the next 2 evenings, we're going to be exploring the stories of materials and their place, role in museums, and how they communicate to a wider public. In a sense, it feels like an ideal subject for this time. If I wanted to summarize what we're trying to do over the next couple of nights, I suppose we'd be thinking about, at a time when works of art are remote from us or from most of us, we need not be remote from them. Today we'll be exploring the stories that accrue to materials, that are inherent in them, or that they shed over time and as they move between places and as centuries pass. Tomorrow we'll be thinking more practically about the role of materials in museums, the history of their display, and how they can be communicated through old techniques or through new technologies. How our session today will work is this. We will start with a panel discussion with 4 very eminent speakers who I'll introduce in a minute. At about 5:50, I'll start to take questions, which can be left in the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and pose them to the speakers. We're then going to move into breakout sessions, and I'll give you a little bit more information about how that will work just before we do. But the idea of those is to allow everybody who is watching around the world to participate in this discussion, rather than simply eavesdropping on it in a way. Without further ado, I'll introduce the speakers. This evening, we have a wonderful set of speakers. Adriano Anonymou, who is Director of Undergraduate Programs at the Department of History of Art at the University of Buckingham, a specialist in the reception of the classical tradition in the early modern period. He's curated various exhibitions, including at the John Soane Museum in London, and he's currently working on an updated edition, or rather, I think it's going to be a rather new edition of Taste in the Antique, which will be published in 2022. Sarah M Guerin is Assistant Professor of Medieval Art at the University of Pennsylvania. Prior to that, she was Assistant Professor at the Université de Montréal until 2016. Her research focuses on material conditions of medieval art, with an emphasis on socioeconomic circumstances that surround production and use. So we're thinking about trade, artisanal organization, techniques and function, as well as the theological conceits that influenced and enabled production. She has a book coming out soon with Cambridge University Press, which is called French Gothic Ivories, Material Theologies and the Sculptor's Craft. Dr. Amin Jaffer is Senior Curator at the Al-Thani Collection and is currently working on a very exciting project to realize a museum space for the collection at the Hôtel de la Marine in Paris. He was previously Senior Curator at the V&A and International Director of Asian Art at Christie's, and has published widely on works of art from the Indian subcontinent, as well as curating many exhibitions on the subject. Susie Nash is Deborah Lower Bryce Professor of Renaissance Art at the Courtauld Institute in London, where she has been teaching since 1993. She's an expert in the late medieval and Renaissance period, and has written widely on painting, sculpture, illuminated manuscripts, on everything from textiles to metalwork to panel painting, and particularly is interested in how art was made, used and viewed, and the value and meaning of materials and their color. She's currently doing research in particular on the Valois courts of France, including and also on the tomb of Philip the Bold, which I think we'll be hearing about in a second. So what I've done is I've asked all the panelists to provide just a couple of images each to get us all in the mood for thinking about the discussion that will follow. And I'm going to ask them just to speak for a couple of minutes about why they've selected those images and what bearing those images have on the subject under discussion today. So first of all, over to you, Adriano.
Thank you very much, Mark. Can you hear me?
We can.
Perfect. So just to start, I selected two images which can, in a way, represent one of the most enduring passion for materials, obsession, in a way, for materials. In this case, ancient color marbles. And this is one of the great characteristics of European art, at least since Hellenistic times onwards. And we tend to forget that Rome was originally built with local materials, which were very poor, very much limited to sedimentary rocks like tufa or travertine. And it's only when they, in a way, were exposed with the expansion of the empire, they were exposed to the wealth and richness of the Hellenistic kingdoms of the East, that they start importing into Rome tons, millions and millions of tons of colored marbles from all the provinces of the empire. So in a way to represent metaphorically and literally the extension of the empire into the capital city and into the great cities of the empire. So floors, walls, you name it, started to be completely veneered with color marbles from the four corners of the empire. So in this sense, really, the medium is the message. So what really counts is the display of incredibly expensive marbles with symbolic connotations from all the parts of the empire. I'm just showing you one of the most famous examples of opus sectile, so marble that is cut and inlaid into wall and floors to make a picture, like in this case. This comes from the Basilica of Junius Bassus, rediscovered in the Renaissance, and really this is one of the models for then the Florentine Pietra Commessa, and renewed passion for color marbles that gripped the Renaissance and Baroque Europe. And here you see that actually the subject relates to the fact that he was involved. He's a consul and a magistrate of Rome, Junius Bassus, and he was involved with the running and administration of the circuses, which very often involved venationes, so the hunts of wild beasts. And here you have, just to name it, green marble from Greece, yellow marble from North Africa. This is the famous alabaster fiorito. So alabaster fiorito, this comes probably from Asia Minor. So in one single panel, you have the whole empire. And this really was was understood by most visitors to the houses of these wealthy patricians. So really, the material aspect of these panels is more important, equally important, but even more important often than the geometric pattern and the figurative pattern, as in this case. The next slide is, and can we move to the next slide, is instead, I chose it to show how the same materials actually could be interpreted and used in a completely different cultural context and time. So we are roughly 1,300 years later than the Basilica of Junius Bassus, but the materials are absolutely the same. So although medieval Europe, Byzantine, the Byzantine world, medieval Europe, and the Renaissance and Baroque Europe was again obsessed with the ancient color marble. There's a wonderful sentence by Andrea De Riccio which says "il mal della pietra," the sickness of the stone. So many antiquarians, humanists, and artists were really interested in the physicality of the medium rather than its figurative applications. In the age of the Enlightenment, you start seeing this stone sampler, and this is one of the most magnificent products of that culture. This was commissioned by a cardinal from Ferrara and donated to this museum in Ferrara already in the 18th century. This is a typical product of the taxonomical mindset of the Enlightenment, by which also here the medium is the message. But here, ancient color marbles are really used from and organized in terms of study, to be studied, to be used didactically, and also in a way to be admired aesthetically. But, and I would like to finish with this, the other thing that we tend to forget is that in 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th century Rome, most of these marbles that you see here, which came from Africa, Asia, Europe, etc., most of the quarries had been extinguished for almost 1,500 years. So Rome had really created an artificial geology by which the stonecutters of Rome dug up the soil of Rome from the Renaissance onwards, but also in medieval times, to find these still numerous blocks that had been imported by the Romans 2,000 years before. So what you see on innumerable tabletops in country houses all over Britain and in the West, it's really the world, the ancient world, on one single slab of inlaid in one single slab of stone. So really the materiality of this is extremely important. And if you start looking at the history of this, of the application of these materials over this long period, you really understand that there is an angle through which you can understand the symbolic use of these materials throughout two millennia and a half, I would say.
Thank you, Adriano. One thing that I would perhaps like to come back to, if we can, is the psychology of materials. We may not have time to cover it, but you mentioned this mal della pietra. And it makes me think of the old porcelain Krankheit, the porcelain sickness. And I wonder how many materials in history have been the grounds in certain contexts for a type of pathology in different places. The other thing that I think is very interesting, and which I do think we might come back to, is the extent to which, in the first slide you showed, this idea that the medium is the message was legible at the time of its making, because clearly the second slide you showed, the lithothek, is a type of bibliothèque, it's a type of library of stones, it's there to be read, even in its format that it's presented. But I am really interested to know about the extent to which we can or can't read certain materials as they're presented to us in different times. Sarah, let me hand over to you.
Great, thank you, Tom. Following on those wonderful marbles, I work on another hard material that is frequently carved, and that's elephant ivory. I specialize in elephant ivories that was carved in the European Middle Ages. Of course, it's been a material that's been prized and adored by Homo sapiens really since the beginning of our symbolic production, about 40,000 years before present. So it's a material that's very close to our hearts as human beings. And so my research looks at ivory from the materiality of ivory from a number of different perspectives. And here we're looking at a wonderful group of 3 statuettes that was commissioned for the Royal Abbey of Saint-Denis outside of Paris, sometime probably in the early 1260s. And it shows us the Virgin Mary holding the Christ child, and she's flanked by 2 angels who are looking up at her adoringly. And so one of the angles that I think is really interesting is how the iconography or the stories that are told in ivory rhyme or echo with a period understanding of what a material was or what it can mean. And so for ivory, I've done a lot of work on the scientific treatises that would have been known in the period, both inherited from antiquity and written in that day, and about the natural world, about geography, and also about medicine. And one of the things that this shows us is that for medieval people in a very broad range of fields, from science to medicine to theology, ivory signified chastity. It was a material that embodied the cold-bloodedness of elephants themselves. And that cold-bloodedness was seen as a frigidity or chastity. And so not only is the material chosen to represent the Virgin Mary, the embodiment, literal embodiment of chastity, but also we can see that the material almost had the ability to have a talismanic effect. And so that's one way that I approach materials. And if we could have the next slide. I'm also very interested in what we call the affordances of the material, or what's possible with ivory because of the high dentine and the high collagen content of dentine, the wonderful silky texture of ivory. You're able to, as a carver, achieve extraordinary details that really aren't possible in any of the other carved media. And so this ability to take extremely fine detail was clearly prized both by the artisans and by the owners, the users, and those who appreciated these statues. But I'm showing you on the other side some of the limitations of ivory. Of course, there's the strangely shaped tusk and a limited size, even with large scale tusks that were coming into Western Europe in the 13th century, one is still relatively limited by the size of the object that you are able to take from a single tusk. And so thinking about the material affordances, in other words, articulates the restrictions and the abilities that one particular material allows us to explore. And then the last approach that I take to the material of ivory, and if we could have the last slide, please, is thinking about the origins of the material. Now, of course, elephants do not grow in Western Europe. There are no elephant herds that are running across France in the 13th century. And so the long distance trade routes that linked Western Europe with sub-Saharan Africa have been one of the areas of deep interest of mine, and in particular of moving towards recently how contemporary understanding of elephant ivory within African cultures, contemporaneous with European Middle Ages, articulated different sort of understanding of the role of a material. And so I explained how ivory signifies chastity for Europe, but what research has shown for the understanding of ivory in Mande cultures in the Middle Ages or a period contemporaneous with the European Middle Ages, is that ivory tusks, elephant tusks, have a sort of spiritual power that in Mande is called niyama. And this is a very powerful life force that has both beneficial benefits and also is dangerous. It's the same sort of function that poisonous plants have, for example. And so the role of talisman, of animal talisman in Mande culture is still extremely important today. And so I'm showing you here a Mande hunter's tunic that is probably early 20th century in the Musée du Quai Branly in Paris, to sort of encapsulate these different ways that materials can mean in their various different cultures. So thanks.
This is a fascinating material, and it really bears on what we want to go and discuss, certainly in terms of thinking about how, in fact, almost the relationship between some of the things you've brought out here, the affordances, or what might be possible or not possible with a material, its properties, its physical properties, organic or inorganic, might somehow be related to beliefs about what that material might mean in a particular context or artistic culture, and also how those properties might be different things and different beliefs in different places. We're going to stay with Ivory, I think, and talk to Amin now. Amin, will you join us?
Hello and good evening, everybody. The chair you have in front of you is one of a suite in the Royal Collection, and it is made of wood, completely veneered with ivory, and any of you who are interested in English furniture will recognize the form immediately. It's very much the type of thing that was in high style in the mid-18th century, in the Chippendale style, we can say. And this and the following slide reveal the deep European interest, the deep British interest in particular, in the exotic materials that they found when they branched out and started to trade and eventually conquer parts of the world. The suite was brought back from India by Alexander Winch, who was governor of Madras Presidency. And in fact, it was made in a coastal town in the presidency called Visakhapatnam. Any of you who go to the art fairs such as Masterpiece will see every year a few pieces of furniture inlaid with ivory or veneered with ivory from Visakhapatnam, which has a very fine natural harbor between Calcutta and Madras, now Chennai. Because of this, ships between the two naturally called into the harbor. And we know already from the late 17th century and into the early 18th century that there developed a production of European style furniture for the visitors who frequented this route. We must remember that traditionally Indians sat on textiles on the ground. They had a very, they really had a floor-based existence, and their domestic interiors were really defined by textiles which were moved around and changed according to the season, according to the day and the climate. Furniture like this was very much European driven. What's exciting about it is really the translation of Western taste and technology into the hands of Indian craftsmen who are using pattern books from Europe, who are working with cabinet makers in India, established in the presidency towns, to produce objects of very, very high style like this. The material is something that has really attracted me to this whole suite of furniture, because what we see here is ivory being manipulated and used in very unlikely forms. A real feat of virtuosic craftsmanship in the production of very large-scale objects like this, completely veneered in ivory. These are functional objects. They were sat on and used. We know that although India has a natural tradition of elephant ivory carving, for pieces of furniture like this, the use was probably ivory imported from Africa. So already in the 18th century, we have a big trade of ivory coming from Africa into India, which is fascinating. And we have a very complicated market that develops between British furniture makers and traders, the Indian craftsmen and middlemen actually making these things, the ships that come from Canton, the China trade vessels that are bringing the various components, whether it's the ivory or the hardwoods that go into producing a piece of furniture like this. The production and the material aspect of this remarkable furniture is only one dimension. The second thing that really interests me is how this ivory was perceived and valued when it comes home, when it comes into grand British collections, grand British houses, big stately homes. As I mentioned, this suite, which was brought back by Alexander Winch, is acquired by George III as a present for Queen Charlotte, who forms a big collection of ivory furniture. And on her death, her inventory shows that she had no less than 50 pieces of ivory furniture. She was creating Indian rooms full of ivory objects. So in a sense, there was a fetishization, she was not the only one, of this rare and luxurious material, representing, in a sense, British domination, conquest and domination of parts of the world that were rich, because coming back from India and loved by Queen Charlotte was not only ivory, but also diamonds, for example. We must think also of the very, very sophisticated Indian textiles coming back at the same time. So there's a whole deep appreciation of these super luxurious, whether they're finished products or natural materials coming out of South Asia. We must remember in the long term, India was seen as the jewel in the crown. So it was also the richness of these materials that were, as Adriano mentioned, not at all from the metropolis or the city or the capital of these empires, but were actually brought in and went into fashioning a lot of what became luxury in the drawing room, first at the highest levels, but also which watered down. I'm also fascinated by the changing role of rich materials like ivory in furniture from the 18th century through to the 19th century, the 20th century, and now with the ban on ivory, the ivory trade, the polemic around ivory. What happens to things like this? Where do they stand in collections? Where do they stand in the market?
Well, I'd love to come back to that a bit later, particularly this idea of where the contemporary ethics surrounding materials meet the historical uses and beliefs about them. I think what you've brought in here, Amin, is fascinating, the sense of the network of trade. But partly I'll also say that when I put together the questions for discussion that would follow, I was thinking about how certain properties that might be intrinsic to materials might have affected what was made out of them, their representation, in the way that Sarah talked about. I think this is a fascinating example where actually an idea or a style has been imposed on the material to create a whole new form and type of furniture in a way. I'm going to move on to Susie and her images, and then we'll come back to discuss more widely.
Hello, hi. Right, hello, I have two very different images that are made of two completely different materials. And the first one is the tomb of Philip the Bold that was made at the turn of the 15th century in Dijon for a major foundation of the Burgundian Duke, Philip the Bold. And it's a tomb that survives today in an altered state. So you need to, I'm afraid, ignore the effigy on top of it for the most part, and indeed all the sort of fussy blue cloth around it, which is all 19th century restoration. But the tomb itself is most famous probably for the arcade of mourners that walk around the underside of it. And those are made of alabaster, and the arcade itself is of marble. And while I am very interested in them and in that material, and I'm very interested in the language and the terminology that are used for those materials, there's a lot of archival evidence about this tomb, and it can tell us a lot about the way people named materials and what that might have meant and the associations they could have. But what I'm really interested in this tomb is actually this great big massive slab of black Dinan marble that the Duke's effigy lay on. And this material is often overlooked, I think, for several reasons. It's very hard to photograph. It's hard, particularly in black and white photographs, which we of course tended to have understood sculpture through most extensively for, until relatively recent really, and still sculptural publications published in black and white. When you photograph it, it just sort of disappears into a sort of grey, and you get no sense of the sort of incredible luster that could be achieved on this material. So the material has meaning and a message. I think this is very much the materials that are chosen for this tomb. The Dinan marble would have had associations of all sorts. The associations go back to Charlemagne, who certainly valued Dinan marble. He sent a massive Dinan marble slab to St. Peter's in Rome, in fact, which had just an engraved inscription on it. Still survives. It's the only object that survives from old St. Peter's in Rome. And he certainly valued it, and I think Philip the Bold, using this material, would have understood some of those associations, but it also had royal associations because it's the material that's used for the tombs of the kings of France in Saint-Denis, and of course beyond. But the thing I'm interested in here is the scale of this block and the difficulty of working a block on that scale, the difficulty of getting this luster. It was a notoriously challenging material to work and to transport. It was incredibly heavy. It's not a true marble, it's actually a limestone, but with a very sort of carbon dense nature to it, which creates the black. And I'm really interested in what this, the impression of this unbelievably sort of massive block would have made on visitors to the Chartreuse de Champmont, and indeed, I think the messages it would have sent out about the status of the Duke. The other thing, just before I move on to my next slide about this material that I think is fascinating, is there are glimpses that it may have had levels of other meaning that we still have to try and, I think, investigate and understand. And one of the things I've come across is that apparently dust from the polishing of this Dinan marble, the polishing of the slabs that were being used for the tombs of the kings of France, was used to make hourglasses. It was a sand, it was used in hourglasses, so to measure time. So that the polishing itself took an extraordinary amount of time. I think to work a block like that to that level would have taken about 4 years. From what I can tell from the documentary evidence. It could take an immense amount of time just to transport it as well, in fact. And so I'm interested in this sort of process. I'm interested in the cost of a material like this. I ought to also point out that the Dinan marble cost 3 times as much as the Carrara marble that was imported from Italy for the effigy of the Duke here. So that's one a material that I think raises all sorts of questions about how we understand and study materials and their evidence and their naming. Could I go on to the next slide? Right, this is an image, a very famous painting by Jan van Eyck. And for those of you who would like to get a better look at this, I would advise you to go to the Closer to Van Eyck website, where you can zoom in incredible detail into this painting. So if you're frustrated by not seeing the details of this image or not being able to see it maybe in high enough resolution, please do this after our session. And I've chosen this as a painting that is very much about materials on all sorts of levels. I think it is a painting that is about the depiction of materials and the depiction of exotic materials. It's made in Bruges in the 1430s by Van Eyck, who is of course the painter of the Burgundian dukes. And Bruges is a center for trade and acquisition and accumulation of all sorts of exotic materials. Lucchese silks that we see depicted here, carpets from Turkey, armor from Milan, and other sorts of exotic materials and elements we see in this painting. So the material here that this is made in, it's Baltic oak, and then it's painted in linseed oil, is in some ways maybe quite prosaic, but the materials it represents are extraordinary and very evocative. But how does it represent those materials? And this leads us to the whole debate about the material and the medium of oil painting. And of course, Van Eyck is at the heart of that. Here we get a whole series of stories that accumulate around him about the invention of oil painting, which are stories. He didn't invent oil painting. But there's also this myth that builds up that he had some sort of material secret, that there's something that he knew about, that he was adding to his oil paint, that could allow him to paint in this way. So we have stories about invention and about secrecy and recipes for a particular way of producing an object like this. And then the third thing about this painting, and the final point, is of course it, I think, provides a very good jumping off point for a discussion about pigments, which of course traveled some distance often to end up in paintings in the north of Europe. And many of you of course will be very aware of the origin of things like ultramarine, which of course at that point is only found in Afghanistan. But also I'm interested in how these pigments are then, the possibilities of them in oil, because while ultramarine is the most expensive pigment, it's true that you could buy at this period, partly because it comes from it's only found in one place, it comes from a long way away, it's also difficult to produce, but it doesn't work very well in oil. And actually the pigment that works best in oil is red lake, and that's the pigment that is used for the Virgin's robe. So that choices of material may be dictated in not just about cost, but also about their working properties. And so they're the sort of things that I would like to think about with regard to this painting. Thank you.
Thank you, Susie, and brings us back in a way to this idea of the affordances of material, or what might be possible through it and in it. Listen, these were extraordinary examples, and we've used up quite a lot of time in hearing about them, but I think they're just such a fascinating take on many approaches to this subject. Let me just jump on to something you said, Susie, first of all, which was when you're talking about this idea of the mystery, the material mystery that Van Eyck might have had in his painting technique and his materials. I mean, taken more broadly, is it something to say that in a sense, you know, materials are always bound to be mysterious to us, however much we know about them? That's something that we're always chasing as researchers or art historians.
Yeah, I think absolutely. That's one of the very exciting things about studying them. I think they are mysterious, and I think that one of the ways we should study them is to try wherever we can to actually replicate them. You learn a huge amount from attempts to replicate, which are always attempts, because they, you know, trying to paint like Van Eyck is, you know, you're bound to fail. But trying to learn how, you know, how you might grind up ultramarine in oil as opposed to how you grind up red lake tells you a great deal about the possibilities for its working. So I think they are mysterious, but we can learn a huge amount about them actually. If wherever we can, we try and replicate them. I mean, it's not possible for me to go and replicate how you carve Dinan marble. That's really difficult. Maybe I could, but you know, other sorts of materials is maybe easier for us to try and replicate and to get some sense of that mystery. But I think that you know, really it's embedded in the history of art. I think that materials are mysterious, and sometimes they're deliberately hidden and deliberately disguised by artists as well. And things, you know, try and look like something else. You know, you might paint a tomb, for example, to look like Dinan marble because you couldn't actually carve it. So you'd paint it black and hope that it passes for something else. So I think there's both something about the sort of hiding of actual materials or passing them off as something else, but also the mystery of, you know, if something is really successful, part of its appeal maybe you cannot conceive of how they actually made that.
Adriano, I'm not going to let you answer that because I want to pass it on to you with something else, which is that I sense in some of the work you're doing, of course, you're thinking about the pursuit of materials and historical pursuits of materials in the 18th century. But would you say that, as an art historian looking around at the field at this point, that the pursuit of a greater understanding of material knowledge is consistent in art history now, or is it sometimes marginalized?
Well, that's a very good question, and I think the fact that we are here today trying to readdress the value that an understanding of material can have in the history of art is quite meaningful in itself, because traditionally, I would say that you know, any art historian would have studied the history of materials, was in any curriculum until probably the 1980s. The fact that now there's a recent flood of studies on materiality, at least in the last 15 years, I think is symptomatic of the fact that our history, at least from the 1917 onwards, has, at least in the academic world, I'm not talking about the curatorial world or the conservators, of course, but in the academic world, art history has moved away from the object very much so, especially in the Anglo-American context. And so the fact that now there is a return to an interest in materiality is quite meaningful in that sense, and it's quite paradoxical on the other, because the study of materials is, I think, one of the essential ingredients of what makes art history a discipline, if you understand what I'm saying. So yes, I think that actually it has not been marginalized. I wouldn't say that it's been marginalized. I certainly would say that a more theoretical approach towards the object certainly doesn't start from the 1970s, because also, you know, all the theoretical approaches of social history of art from the 1940s, or the Warburg School, an interest in the subjects rather than in the materiality of the object, certainly drives away from the materials. But on the other hand, I think it's absolutely necessary to understand materials not only as an essential component of the object in itself. So I'm stating the obvious here, but also, and this is what Susie was saying now, it's very often, especially in the pre-modern, if we put ourselves in a pre-modern mentality, we need to never forget that materials were very often infused with magical connotations in the great chain of being that linked, the prime mover down to minerals. So really, an understanding of materials can add a lot in terms of symbolic meaning of an artwork.
One of the things that I really want this discussion to touch on, and maybe certainly in the breakout sessions, is the extent to which we're trying to sympathize with those magical connotations or re-enter them, not just to replicate materials, but replicate the modes of thought that came along with them, not to live according to them. Sarah, you'd like to come in there.
Yeah, can I jump in on that notion of magic? Because we have all these ways of understanding the efficacy of materials that are at our fingertips today. Magnetism of iron, radioactivity of uranium. And I think one of the interesting points is that, relatively few of us really understand the science behind the effectiveness of those materials. And yet we accept it as given that they're active materials and they function and they have an impact on us and our lives. And so I wanted to kind of question or problematize the setting aside of the properties of materials as merely being magical and sort of unscientific thinking, because a lot of this is really coming from the very early understanding of the study of materials. And you can read Albertus Magnus, for example, who's a great scholastic writer and a foundational thinker about materials in the early 13th century. And he wasn't talking about these this matter as magical. He was trying, it was an early epistemology, a way of understanding the world, and which included some senses of magic, but it was a very capacious way of approaching the material world that I don't think can be reduced just to theology, nor just to magical wishful thinking.
But I suppose we're talking to a certain degree about what any group of people at any time think they know about a material, and what they think they understand about a material as well, and not just what they know and what they understand. I mean, let me just draw you in on going back to Adriano's point, because I think he was drawing a distinction between how materials have perhaps been treated in the academy and in museums and the market even. And of course, your career trajectory has allowed you to handle a lot more objects perhaps than some in academia. It must almost be a strange thing to hear academic art historians talking about the fact that objects and materials in particular might not somehow be central to what people are studying.
Yeah, but I think on that point, I completely agree with Adriano that there has been an overlooking or kind of a less importance put on material until the last 15 years or so, and we've reinstantiated these objects of our study into their materiality. I mean,
yeah, and let me see. I mean, can I just pass that to you as well?
Yeah, well, I think the when I was working at Christie's, for example, and whenever we were assessing to focus on Ivory, which I've selected for our session today, whenever you're assessing something in Ivory, in the years that I was there, 2007 to 2017, one of the big issues is, of course, the marketability of something in Ivory, given all the restrictions, given all of the complications of shipping it, of owning it, of sometimes the moral issue of supporting the Ivory market, even if it's for a historic object. And it was at a time when it was not only ivory that was becoming problematic. It was endangered woods, it was tortoiseshell, it was ebony, for example. And so these were instances of people looking not at the spiritual dimension, the meaning of the material, but the complexities of owning it. And this was determining, therefore, their channel of collecting, their idea that certain materials are made for the museum, perhaps, not made for the home, or undermining an entire market or collectorship for certain types of things because of the legalities of owning. So material was definitely something that we were encountering in those years in the art, the art market.
I want to go back to the point that I made about how far we might be trying to enter into sort of the types of consciousness of how materials were understood, because I think, Susie, your example was quite extraordinary. There's Dinan marble and what you said almost about how it's been mediated so much by photography, and the way that there are these barriers that our modes of studying material have set up to actually how we understand the material. I mean, you know, you've talked about replicating first of all, but you know what? Yeah, sorry.
Well, I think something about photography is really important here, and I think it was Andre Malraux who said, art history is the history of that which can be photographed, and this really has dictated, I think, the direction of our discipline. You can really trace that very emphatically in that, things which are focused on often in academic study are the things which are most I guess photogenic often, and there's certain types of medium and certain types of material which are just not photogenic, particularly in black and white. And I think that our history, this new interest in materials, which I would say, I've always been interested in materials and objects, but it feels like something that is it's been very fashionable, obviously, in the last 15 years or so. I think that it's directly connected to the shift to digital photography, because we can now, and online, the way we can zoom in on things, and the fact that we as art historians can take our own photographs from all sorts of different angles, in all sorts of different lights, and understand objects completely differently. And I think that really it's fundamental that we've been able to look at them differently because we've been able to photograph them differently. And also, photographs sort of take hundreds of photographs of an object that might be very complex in 3 dimensions, whereas we were always reliant before on 1 or 2 set views, and that dictated how we understood that object. And so I think I think it's really that you must, I think if you're looking at the history of materials, you need to embed that with the history of photography and the history of the visual historiography of art history, not just the written historiography of art history.
You make me think of what Susan Sontag writes in On Photography, the famous passage about various beliefs and where you're photographing somebody, you might be capturing their soul, but perhaps with digital photography, you can somehow capture the soul of an object. I mean, it's a fanciful notion. We had some really fascinating discussion earlier in the slides about how the stories and histories of materials have informed the development of artistic styles, and also representational choices when we were looking at the example from Van Eyck. I suppose that's not so much the case in the material you showed at the start, Adriano. But let me ask that question about the legibility, or you talked about the medium being the message. But to what extent can you fathom how far people who looked at that opus seculae work were able to read the map of the places where each stone had come from?
Well, we have, I'll give you two answers. One is linked to the Roman passion for marble and something that is much earlier. So the use of white marble in archaic Greek sculpture. So we have a wealth, not a wealth is a big word. We have some written evidence that marbles were the origins of these marbles and the symbolic implications of assembling them in interiors was very well understood also in Roman times. So, for instance, we have each time Rome conquered a new province, public buildings, especially from the Flavian period onwards, started to use a wealth of specific materials coming from that specific region to signify the arrival of a new province into the empire. Or if you think of the Pantheon, for instance, which is a building and tries to encapsulate the multicultural nature of the Roman Empire, because you have a pedimented portico, which is Greek, you have the monolithic columns, which comes from Egypt, so the two jewels in the crown of the empire. And then you have the dome, which is a typical Roman architectural typology. But even the floor, which is still there today, mostly heavily restored, has marble coming from certain regions that were clearly displayed within the Pantheon in terms of visibility, if you see what I mean. And then we have, we have a whole set of reactions from the moralists, from Pliny and Vitruvius onwards, who actually accuse all these patricians of veneering their houses with these precious materials, quoting the specific sources where they were quarried just in order to display conspicuous consumptions. And for them, this was a clear sign of decadence. So we don't have, to answer more specifically your question, we don't have sources for an awareness linked to all of the marbles, but certainly for some of the marbles, and certainly for porphyry and serpentine. Porphyry was the imperial marble, so the red volcanic stone from East Egypt. Porphyry was immediately understood by everybody as associated with imperial authority. Also serpentine, so the Greek one, and many others. So that as soon as you saw, a floor made of porphyry, a bust or a statue made of porphyry, or you name it, you could be absolutely certain that that message was clearly understood by everybody.
Sarah, just Adriano has brought up, what we have in a partial record of a culture, and one that was fairly well documented in the way that we might kind of understand in an archival sense. I thought it's very interesting the contrast between the types of objects that you showed and the work you've been doing on the Mande peoples and objects made by them. I suppose what I want to ask is, are you somehow veering into the work of an anthropologist when you're thinking about how those materials relate to the culture that made them? I mean, you're comparing perhaps different traditions that are recorded in different ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much. Working on the deep history of Africa is a very different sort of historical enterprise than doing so in Western Europe or in the ancient Greco-Roman world. And so certainly it relies on tools such as ethnography and oral history to be able to reconstitute sort of suggestions of the past. But there's a huge influence and impact of archaeology as well. And so one of the things that I found really fascinating is in that the digs, the archaeological digs at Geno on the inland Niger Delta, for example, which was a city where early Mende people lived. And there are kind of similar talismans, animal talismans that have been pierced for attachment to something that have come out of the archaeological record from both from BCE and CE context, so before the Common Era and from the Common Era. So it seems that this is a gesture or a belief or an approach to the material world that has very, very deep roots in this region. But of course, the sort of historical move that one makes is very different.
And I mean, thinking about the trade routes that you mapped out for us with your example, you know, the extent to which we're telling a story of reception history against the story of how the materials move, there's a fine balance there, isn't there, in interpretation?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point because, you know, a question that has bothered me for well over a decade now is what would a medieval person have known about the origin of materials? It's extremely different from the example that Amin was giving of the connection, the deep connection of ivory with India, even if the ivory that was being used to make those pieces of furniture was actually coming from East Africa. And so being able to prove and kind of convince oneself that the users and owners of ivories in the medieval period were aware of the long trade, long distance trade route that brought the material to the workbenches or to someone's private altar is very difficult. And I think that obviously in a period that's a bit more adjacent to Professor Nash's, by the end of the 14th century, there's extraordinary developments in cartography, and there's a much better awareness among the elites, literate elites, of where these materials are coming from. But earlier, around kind of the first decades of the 13th century, it's a bit harder to prove. And my inkling is that there's a reliance on the biblical narratives, the stories that would have been much more familiar for the identification of where the materials came from.
I mean, do you want to come in on the trade histories of
I would say, of course, that it was the quest for exotica, for spices in particular, but, you know, diamonds, gold, wealth, that propelled the whole age of the discoveries from Portugal, from Spain onwards. And the whole idea of reaching out to the world was to come back with the rich materials that had been written about in text historically. There was also the very big need, the very direct need for certain things from South and East Asia following the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople and the blocking of the Eastern Mediterranean. But I would say that if we shift to the 18th century, let's say pre-direct British conquest of much of South Asia, there was certainly a sense among elites in Britain that what they were enjoying were the fruits of very high commerce with the East. And that the ivory furniture was probably at the very top. It was something collected by the Queen and the very high aristocracy. But the point is that it was a century in which we see not just ivory, but lacquer, silk, superfine printed textiles, cashmeres, porcelain, tea, chocolate. You know, it's a complete consumer revolution. And I think that through the 18th century, the sense was, and you saw the activity in the London docks, you saw the activity in Amsterdam, you saw it through the Marchand Mercier in Paris. There was a whole fascination with this exotica and a belief that it was the product, it was the result of these successful diplomatic and trading ventures. In the 19th century, it changes very dramatically because you have, for the Brits at least, and then later for the French, for example, an outright conquest. And there it's much more about products of the colonies, submission to the mother country, the very best woods, the very best materials, everything that comes out of the empire that is the most prime, that's the most sought after, is remitted to London, for example. It's presented, it's used, it's consumed, it's worked in London. So it's very much a different thing. It's about a trade story, but I think it's part of the narrative in Britain in the 18th century and 19th century of commercial success, followed by huge military success. And it's not just the trade with and the conquest in South Asia. It's also tied in with control of the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, what happens with the defeat of Napoleon. It's about mastery of the seas. It falls into a bigger story about empire.
We're already running slightly over, and we ought to be moving to the breakout sessions. There are a couple of questions in the chat box. I'm going to bring one of them up, and I'm going to leave one of them dangling, perhaps for people to talk about in their breakout sessions. The one I'm going to leave dangling is one about recommendations for books about the history of materials that we recommended for undergraduates. But I actually think, for all of us, frankly, so that's something we might come to. But there's a question about which ties into what you were just talking about, Amin, which is about the sort of meeting point between how a material might be valued because of traditional associations, and how it might be valued because what new technologies and methods of making it into art become possible. It strikes me that the object you presented, I mean, somehow it shows us how the traditional associations can to a degree be erased quite quickly with the imposition of new technologies, of the possibilities of travel, of the possibilities of trade.
The other thing, if I may add, is that with this type of furniture, it's so curious because the makers are Indians who themselves have an idea about ivory. It's a material that is very rich and deep in Indian culture, and they're manipulating it and using it in the production of objects that are really outside of their use. They're producing things that are outside of their own culture, as it were. It's very much something that is an alien object. And when these objects, I speak of the furniture specifically, comes to the West, it's also considered alien. It's also considered to be this strange thing. The form is recognizable, but the material is exotic. And when I started as a young curator at the V&A, looking at this sort of furniture, what was remarkable for me, what was striking, was the furniture department would say, that really isn't in our remit, it's Indian. And the Indian department would say, well, that's Western furniture, it's not in our remit, it's not really Indian. So these are objects that were outside of any one culture.
Listen, I'm afraid we do have to end at 6:30, and we do want to have some conversations with the people who have been watching in the meantime. I've heard enough to give me material to suggest another 4 or 5 symposiums for Masterpiece, if not more, over the next few years. It's been a wonderful discussion. Thank you all so much.